My name is Ruth Bennett. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady, dependable, calm, the one who listens more than she speaks. I live a quiet, ordinary life on the surface: work, marriage, routines that look unremarkable from the outside. And that ordinariness is often what makes people underestimate me. I've learned that when you don't raise your voice, when you don't dramatize pain, people assume there isn't much depth there. They think silence means agreement, or weakness, or passivity. They don't imagine that silence can be a form of discipline, or that stillness can be a place where decisions are being made carefully, deliberately, and without spectacle. I'm not telling this story to entertain you with scandal, and I'm not here to humiliate anyone, not even the man I was married to. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about clarity. It's about what happens when reality interrupts the narrative you've been trying to preserve. I found out my husband was having an affair during our marriage counseling session. The truth came out where honesty was supposed to begin. What follows isn't a dramatic explosion. There were no raised voices, no thrown objects, no cinematic confrontation. This is a slower story, one about accumulation, small dismissals, quiet compromises, roles assigned without consent. It's about how emotional imbalance can exist for years without being named, and how a single moment of truth can quietly reorder everything. You'll hear how I was seen by others, and how I allowed that perception to continue longer than I should have. You'll hear about the subtle shifts that didn't seem important at the time, but later revealed a pattern. You'll hear about silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of observation. And you'll hear about what it means to move forward without cruelty, without spectacle, and without losing yourself in the process. I'm sharing this not to ask for sympathy, but to offer recognition. Many people live inside dynamics where they are useful, reliable, and invisible all at once. Many people sense something is wrong long before they can prove it. And they learn to doubt themselves because everything looks fine from the outside. This story is about reclaiming authority over your own perception, about choosing truth over comfort, and about discovering that dignity doesn't require noise. If you've ever felt quietly sidelined in a relationship that was supposed to be built on honesty, what part of yourself did you learn to hide in order to keep the peace? To most people, I was easy to define. I was the reasonable one, the calm wife, the woman who didn't complain, didn't push, didn't make scenes. At dinner parties, I was the one refilling glasses while conversations flowed around me. At family gatherings, I was introduced with a smile that said, "She keeps everything running." And in my marriage, I was often described by my husband, by friends, even by the counselor later on, as low maintenance. It was meant as a compliment. What it really meant was that I didn't disrupt the atmosphere. I learned early that being agreeable made life smoother. When I noticed small inconsistencies, I filed them away instead of asking questions. When I felt dismissed, I told myself I was being too sensitive. I had a talent for smoothing edges, especially other people's discomfort. Over time, that talent became my identity. People saw me as stable, predictable, emotionally mature, invisible, but in a flattering way. My husband used to say I was his anchor, the one who kept things grounded. He liked telling people that I never overreacted. and I believed that was something to be proud of. I thought emotional restraint was the same as emotional strength. What I didn't realize was how often restraint was being mistaken for consent. In conversations, I was the one who listened. I remembered details, followed up, and adjusted my expectations quietly. When decisions were made about trips, finances, schedules, they often arrived already formed. I'd nod, ask practical questions, and make it work. No one was cruel. That's important to say. There were no insults, no obvious betrayals at first, just a steady pattern of me adapting and others proceeding. If you asked anyone who knew us, they would have said we were fine, comfortable, maybe a little boring, but solid. We were the couple of people pointed to when they talked about long term potential. And I reinforced that image. I smiled at the right moments. I kept disagreements private. I absorbed disappointment silently and told myself that marriage wasn't about constant fulfillment. It was about commitment, compromise, and maturity. I was very good at being the adult in the room. What no one seemed to notice was how often my role was reactive. I responded, I adjusted, I accommodated. Rarely did I initiate emotional direction, and over time, that became expected. I didn't think of myself as small. I thought of myself as disciplined. But discipline without mutual regard becomes something else entirely. In social settings, my husband would speak for both of us plans, opinions, preferences. He wasn't domineering, he was confident. And I let that confidence stand in for unity. If I corrected him, it felt unnecessary. If I disagreed, it felt disruptive. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because it seemed easier, more efficient, kinder. People often confuse kindness with self erasure. I did too. There were moments, small, almost forgettable ones, where I felt a flicker of something sharper, a comment that didn't quite land right, a joke at my expense that lingered longer than it should have, a decision made without checking in. Each time, I told myself it wasn't worth addressing, that love meant letting things go, that not every feeling deserved airtime. I became very skilled at minimizing my own reactions. From the outside, I looked unbothered. From the inside, I was carefully observing. I noticed patterns even when I didn't name them. I remembered dates, tones, shifts in attention. I just didn't act on them yet. Because acting would have required me to disrupt the role I had been assigned and had quietly accepted. Reliable, understanding, low maintenance. The kind of woman who could be depended on to hold everything together without asking for much in return. At least, that's who they thought I was. What they never asked was who I was becoming while playing that part. The first time something truly registered, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no argument, no revelation, just a moment so small that at the time I almost dismissed it out of habit. We were at a casual gathering, nothing formal. A few friends, familiar faces, easy conversation. Someone asked my husband how things were going between us. He smiled, shrugged lightly, and said, "You know Ruth. She's steady, not very emotional but dependable." Everyone laughed softly. It was said kindly, affectionately, even. And yet something in me tightened, not because it was untrue. I was steady, but because of what was missing. There was no mention of closeness, warmth, or partnership. I had been reduced to a function, a trait list, useful qualities stripped of intimacy. I remember nodding along, smiling when someone glanced at me for confirmation. I didn't correct him. I didn't add anything. I told myself I was overthinking it. But I didn't forget. That was the beginning of a pattern I would later recognize as the first small cut. The kind that doesn't bleed enough to demand attention, but still leaves a mark. After that, I started noticing how often my emotional presence was summarized rather than experienced. How I was spoken about more than spoken to. If I shared a concern, it was met with logic instead of curiosity. If I expressed uncertainty, it was smoothed over quickly, as if efficiency mattered more than understanding. And every time I responded the same way, I adjusted. I told myself this was what emotional maturity looked like, that wanting to be understood was childish, that love didn't need constant validation, it needed stability. The world around me reinforced that belief. Friends admired our calm. Family praised how easy our relationship seemed. No one saw the cost of that ease, including me. The first small cut wasn't betrayal. It wasn't even neglect in an obvious sense. It was being redefined quietly, in front of others, without objection. I became the woman who didn't need much. The woman whose inner life could be summarized in a sentence. And because I didn't protest, that summary hardened into truth. There was another moment not long after. We were discussing plans, something minor, but important to me. He interrupted before I finished my thought, finished the sentence for me, and moved on. No one noticed. I noticed, not the interruption itself, but how natural it felt for him. How unsurprised he was that I didn't reclaim the flow. How quickly the conversation accepted his version of my thought as sufficient. I felt a quiet disappointment, not in him, but in myself. Because part of me had already learned that speaking up would feel like an inconvenience. So I let it go. That's how these things normalize. Not through cruelty, but through repetition without resistance. Each small cut taught me something, not about him, but about the space I occupied. It taught me that my silence made things easier for everyone else, that discomfort only existed if I named it, and that by staying quiet, I could preserve the image of harmony. What I didn't realize then was that harmony built on omission isn't harmony at all. It's an agreement to look away. But at that stage, I wasn't ready to see it that way. I still believed that being understanding meant absorbing more than I expressed, that love meant giving the benefit of the doubt indefinitely. So I catalogued the moments, stored them somewhere private. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I simply paid attention. And that attention, quiet, patient, unresolved, would become important later. Because the first small cut isn't the one that breaks you. It's the one that teaches you where you're allowed to feel pain and where you're expected not to. Once you've dismissed the first small cut, the others arrive more easily, not sharper, just more frequent. They blend into the background of daily life. Tone shifts, assumptions, casual overrides that don't register as conflicts because no one ever names them as such. And because I had already proven myself capable of absorbing discomfort quietly, the pattern settled in without resistance. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as familiarity. My husband would make decisions and inform me afterward, always with the assumption that I would adapt. If I hesitated, he'd frame it as practicality. This just makes more sense. And because I valued logic, I learned to accept logic even when it bypassed emotional consent. When I expressed fatigue or distance, he'd respond with reassurance rather than inquiry. You're just tired. Work has been stressful for you lately. He didn't ask why I felt the way I did. He explained it away, and I let him. Because explanation feels safer than exploration. Exploration invites change. Friends followed a similar rhythm. They'd check in, but lightly. Surface questions, easy answers. I gave them what they expected. I didn't want to burden anyone with nuance. I didn't want to seem dissatisfied when everything looked stable. So I played my part well. I became the woman who could be relied upon not to complicate things. The woman who handled emotional weight internally. The woman didn't require reassurance because she appeared self contained. I told myself this was independence. In reality, it was isolation dressed up as strength. There were moments when I considered saying something, when a joke crossed the line, when my absence in a decision felt pointed, when I realized I was the only one adjusting. But each time, I calculated the cost. Would it create tension? Would it require a long conversation? Would it make me seem demanding? And every time I decided it wasn't worth it. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day and accept less. You arrive there through a series of small choices made in the name of peace. The most dangerous part was how reasonable it all felt. Nothing was overt enough to justify confrontation. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is unacceptable." Instead, there was a slow erosion of mutuality, a quiet shift from partnership to management. I managed my expectations. I managed my reactions. I managed my disappointment. What I didn't manage was the growing sense that I was being edited out of my own life. Sometimes I would replay conversations in my head, not to argue, but to check whether I had imagined the imbalance. I'd ask myself if I was being unfair, if maybe this was just what long term relationships became. And because I didn't want to be the person who overanalyzed, I defaulted to self doubt. That doubt became a convenient buffer for everyone else. The more I rationalized, the more normalized the dynamic became. People stopped checking in deeply because I never signaled distress. My husband stopped noticing my withdrawal because it was quiet and non confrontational. Silence is very easy to misinterpret when it's consistent. Inside, though, something was shifting. Not anger, not resentment. Awareness. I began to see how often my compliance was assumed, how rarely my perspective was sought unless it was logistical, how my emotional life had become something that existed privately, separate from the relationship it was supposed to be shared within. And still, I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid to speak, but because I hadn't yet accepted what speaking might reveal. Acknowledging the disrespect would have required me to acknowledge the imbalance. And acknowledging the imbalance would have required me to decide what to do about it. At that stage, I wasn't ready to choose disruption over familiarity. So I normalized it. I told myself that relationships evolve, that this was a phase, that things would rebalance on their own. They didn't. Instead, the role I played became more defined, less questioned, more permanent. And by the time I realized how far things had shifted, I had already taught everyone, including myself, that I would tolerate being minimized without protest. That lesson would take time to unlearn. Roles are rarely discussed out loud. They're implied, reinforced, and eventually treated as natural. By the time I became aware of mine, it had already settled into place. I was the reliable one, the woman who remembered appointments, smoothed logistics, and kept things moving. I handled the quiet labor of life, the kind that doesn't get noticed unless it's missing. Emotional regulation, scheduling, remembering preferences, anticipating needs before they were voiced. My husband trusted me with responsibility, but not with influence. I was consulted on execution, not direction. I made things work after decisions had already been made. At first, I told myself this was a partnership. That division of roles was practical, that not everyone needed to lead in the same ways. But slowly, I realized my role came with expectations I had never agreed to. I was expected to be understanding before being understood, to be flexible before being considered, to absorb tension so others didn't have to. When I expressed hesitation, it was framed as stress. When I expressed dissatisfaction, it was framed as temporary. My emotions were treated like weather, passing conditions, not meaningful signals. And because I didn't push back, the role hardened. I became the emotional background, the steady presence that allowed others to move freely without friction. My consistency made everything else feel secure. But security without reciprocity is a one-sided contract. What troubled me most wasn't that I had been assigned this role. It was how seamlessly I had stepped into it, how little resistance I offered, how often I told myself that being needed was enough, even when being known wasn't happening. There were moments when I sensed the imbalance clearly. Watching my husband light up in conversations with others in ways he didn't with me. I heard enthusiasm in his voice that I hadn't heard directed toward me in a long time. I told myself it was comfort, familiarity. Long-term relationships settle, I thought. Passion transforms. But comfort shouldn't erase curiosity. I realized that my presence had become assumed. My absence is unimaginable. I was integral, but not actively chosen. That realization didn't hurt in a sharp way. It was quieter than that. It felt like being slowly misplaced. The role also came with an unspoken rule. I wasn't supposed to disrupt. Not emotionally, not socially, not narratively. Our relationship had a story attached to it, a story of stability, maturity, mutual respect. And I was one of its main supporting characters. To question the role was to question the story. So I stayed within the script. I nodded. I accommodated. I reassured others that everything was fine. But internally, something important shifted. I began to see the difference between being valued and being relied upon, between being loved and being convenient. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't demand change. I simply stopped telling myself comforting lies. That was the beginning of something new. Not action, not yet, but clarity. I started paying attention to where my presence was optional, where my voice was interchangeable, where my emotional world existed in isolation. And in that awareness, I understood something crucial. Roles persist not because they are fair, but because they are unchallenged. Mine had gone unchallenged for a very long time. And although I didn't know it then, the moment I truly recognized that role was also the moment it began to lose its power over me. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic realization that arrived fully formed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it almost felt insignificant. I was alone at home, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the usual signs of shared life. Two mugs in the sink, a jacket draped over a chair, familiarity everywhere. And for the first time, I felt like a guest in my own marriage. That feeling wasn't new, but that day, I didn't explain it away. Normally, I would have redirected my attention, found something productive to do, told myself I was tired or overthinking. But instead, I stayed with the discomfort. I let it sit there without rushing to resolve it. And something inside me changed. I realized I had been spending years interpreting my own emotional signals in ways that made everyone else comfortable. I had been translating my instincts into excuses. I had been loyal not just to my husband, but to the image of us. That afternoon, I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. If nothing changes, can I live like this indefinitely? Not should I. Not could I endure it. But would I choose it? The answer arrived calmly, without panic, without sadness. No, that was the moment things shifted. Not outwardly. Nothing about my behavior changed that day. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I didn't make plans. What changed was internal. I stopped assuming my discomfort was a flaw to be corrected. I started treating it as information. I realized that my silence hadn't been neutral. It had been active. It had shaped the dynamic just as much as anyone else's behavior. And while I couldn't control others, I could control how much access they had to my inner compliance. From that point on, I listened differently. When my husband spoke, I noticed not just what he said, but what he didn't ask. When decisions were made, I observed how naturally my agreement was assumed. When affection appeared, I noticed whether it was responsive or intentional. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was awake. That awareness brought with it an unexpected calm. Because once you stop arguing with reality, you stop exhausting yourself. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need validation. I just needed to be honest with myself. That day, I understood something I had misunderstood for years. Silence is only virtuous when it's chosen freely. When it's automatic, it becomes a habit of self-erasure. And I was done erasing myself. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. From the outside, I was the same Ruth. Reliable, composed, steady. But internally, I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I no longer needed reassurance that things were fine. I no longer needed to rationalize the imbalance. I had accepted the truth of my experience without trying to soften it. That acceptance didn't make me sad. It made it clear. And clarity is dangerous, not to others, but to systems built on your compliance. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity. I only knew that I would not give it back. That was the day something shifted. After that day, my silence changed its texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct to smooth, to preserve, to avoid friction. Now, it was intentional, measured, chosen. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still nodded, still listened, still fulfilled my role with the same competence. But internally, I had stepped back from automatic agreement. I stopped filling in emotional gaps for others. When my husband spoke without checking in, I noticed and didn't compensate. When conversations drifted past me, I let them. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to correct or comply. Not out of spite, out of observation. People often believe silence signals weakness. because they don't understand what disciplined silence looks like. They assume that if you aren't reacting, you aren't aware. In reality, awareness is often the quietest state. I began to see how often my previous silence had been interpreted as permission, how quickly others filled the space I no longer managed, how discomfort surfaced when I stopped smoothing it away. And still, no one confronted me. They didn't ask if something was wrong. They simply adjusted around my quiet withdrawal, assuming it was temporary, assuming I would return to form. That assumption gave me space. In that space, I started paying closer attention to details I had once ignored: patterns of timing, shifts in mood, inconsistencies in stories that didn't quite align but hadn't mattered before. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I was simply no longer invested in preserving the illusion of harmony. My husband mistook my calm for contentment. He became more relaxed, more careless. When people believe you won't challenge them, they stop editing themselves. That's when you see clearly. I noticed how his phone never left his side, how certain topics redirected the conversation quickly, how intimacy became predictable, then distant, then procedural. I didn't confront him. Confrontation would have ended my access to truth. Instead, I listened. I asked neutral questions. I observed responses. I noticed what was volunteered and what was avoided. I watched how easily explanations came when they were rehearsed, and how vague they were when they weren't. Silence gave me leverage, not because it was manipulative, but because it removed distraction. Without emotional noise, patterns emerge. I also noticed something else: my own emotional state. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't consumed. I felt grounded. That surprised me. I realized that by choosing silence, I had reclaimed something essential: my internal authority. I was no longer outsourcing my reality to other people's explanations. And with that authority came patience. I didn't need answers immediately. I didn't need certainty. I trusted that clarity would arrive when enough information accumulated. And it did, but not yet. At this stage, silence wasn't a weapon. It was a filter. It let truth pass through, while everything performative fell away. Others mistook it for disengagement, for emotional withdrawal, for weakness. They couldn't see that I was no longer participating in a dynamic that required me to be smaller. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning. And that repositioning, quiet, unannounced, unnoticed, was the most powerful move I had made so far. What people rarely understand about quiet women is that we notice everything. When I stopped managing the emotional environment, I gained time, mental space, energy that had previously been spent translating, excusing, cushioning. That energy didn't disappear, it sharpened. And what I began to see wasn't shocking, it was consistent. Small details started arranging themselves into a pattern. Not dramatic clues, not obvious proof, just alignment. My husband's schedule grew oddly rigid and strangely vague at the same time. Certain evenings became non negotiable, while others were left open with little explanation. When plans changed, they changed smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if contingency had already been built in. I noticed how often he checked his phone, not compulsively, but strategically. Brief glances, quick replies, the kind of behavior that looks invisible unless you're no longer looking away. I didn't snoop. I didn't check messages or follow him or interrogate timelines. That kind of urgency belongs to panic, not clarity. Instead, I documented mentally dates, behaviors, emotional availability, patterns of presence and absence. I began journaling, not about suspicions, but about facts. What was said, what was done, what was avoided. I kept it neutral, almost clinical. No interpretation, just data. That was something they never noticed. I had stopped reacting and started recording. In conversations, I listened for inconsistencies. When stories were repeated, I noticed what shifted. When explanations were given, I paid attention to how quickly they arrived and how unnecessary they felt. People lie most when they believe they are safe, and safety, I had learned, is often mistaken for silence. I also noticed how my husband responded to my emotional neutrality. He seemed lighter, less guarded. He shared more freely, not deeply, but casually. He assumed I was uninterested, or secure, or simply unchanged. He didn't realize that my lack of reaction wasn't indifference. It was a focus. I observed how he talked about me to others, still kindly, still respectfully, but increasingly vaguely. I was referenced as part of a structure, not a relationship. The marriage was something that existed in the background, unquestioned. That told me something important. People don't hide what they fear losing. They hide what they assume is immovable. I also began to notice myself, how my body reacted before my mind did, how certain explanations landed with a dull finality instead of reassurance, how my intuition no longer whispered, it simply stated. There was no panic in it, no drama, just recognition. What they never noticed was how methodical I had become, how I was quietly preparing, not for confrontation, but for truth. I read, not about affairs, but about patterns of emotional disengagement, about how secrecy forms not out of malice, but convenience, about how people justify behavior when they no longer see their partner as an active witness. I didn't do this to confirm a suspicion. I did it to understand my reality without distortion. I also reviewed my own resources: financial, emotional, logistical. Not because I planned to leave, but because clarity demands readiness. I wanted to know what choices I actually had, not just the ones I told myself I had. All of this happened invisibly. No change in tone, no shift in routine, no dramatic withdrawal. If anything, I became easier to live with. And that's the paradox no one talks about. When you stop asking for honesty from someone who is hiding, they relax. That relaxation is revealing. I wasn't hunting for proof. I wasn't waiting for a confession. I was letting the truth approach me at its own pace. Because truth always surfaces eventually, especially when you stop interrupting it with fear. By the time I sensed that something concrete was near, I was already steady, grounded, prepared to receive whatever arrived without collapsing. What they never noticed was that my quiet had evolved again. It was no longer just observation, it was positioning. And once you've positioned yourself internally, the external reveal, when it comes, doesn't destroy you. It confirms what you already know. The truth didn't arrive with drama. There was no shaking hands, no racing heart, no cinematic pause. When it finally surfaced, it felt almost orderly, as if my mind had already made space for it. It happened quietly, in a way that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't already learned how to see. We were preparing for our marriage counseling session, the one we had both agreed to attend just to recalibrate. That was the language my husband used: recalibration, as if the relationship were a machine slightly out of alignment, not a human bond quietly unraveling. In the days leading up to it, He was unusually composed, almost relieved. He spoke about counseling as if it were a formality, something that would confirm we were fundamentally fine. That confidence stayed with me. The private reveal didn't come from his phone or an overheard conversation. It came from a contradiction so small, so precise, that it removed all remaining doubt. A name, not spoken with guilt, not hidden, mentioned casually, in a context that didn't require explanation, because he assumed I already understood. And in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. Not shock, alignment. All the fragments I had been holding, without forcing them together, suddenly formed a single, coherent picture. The emotional distance, the rehearsed availability, the relaxed secrecy, the unexamined assumptions. It wasn't the name itself that mattered, it was the certainty. I didn't confront him, I didn't ask questions, I didn't seek clarification, because clarity had already arrived. I excused myself, went into another room, and sat down. I remember noticing how steady my hands were, how even my breathing felt. I wasn't dissociating, I wasn't numbing out. I was present. That's how I knew this was real. There was no urge to verify, to double check, to search for evidence. Those impulses belonged to disbelief. I was past that stage. What I felt instead was a clean, almost austere understanding. This is what has been happening. No embellishment, no moral collapse, just truth. I didn't feel the need to tell anyone, not friends, not family, not even myself, out loud. I let it sit. I spent the rest of the day moving through routine with deliberate normalcy, cooking, cleaning, responding, observing him observe me. He noticed nothing. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't imagine confrontations. I slept. And in the morning, I woke up with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. Not anger, not vengeance. Just a clear internal line that could not be uncrossed. I understood then why the reveal had needed to be private first. Why couldn't I arrive in front of anyone else? I needed to meet the truth without witnesses, without influence, without noise, so that my response would belong entirely to me. By the time we arrived at the counseling session days later, I wasn't going in to discover anything. I was going in to listen. I knew the truth. What remained was to see how it would present itself when honesty was supposed to begin. By the time we sat down in the counselor's office, the decision wasn't whether I would act. It was how. The room was neutral, soft lighting, careful decor, chairs arranged to suggest balance. A space designed for calm admissions and shared responsibility. My husband sat beside me, relaxed, almost practiced in his posture. He spoke easily about stress, miscommunication, and distance. Words chosen to sound honest without being specific. I listened, not as a wife searching for reassurance, but as a witness already in possession of the truth. There's a moment when you know something irreversible, where time feels different, slower, more deliberate. Each sentence matters because you understand what it's building toward. The counselor asked gentle questions about connection, about trust, about what we were hoping to repair. My husband answered first. He spoke about feeling disconnected, about routine, about how neither of us was doing anything wrong, but something had been missing. He framed it as mutual drift, shared responsibility. And I understood then why this moment mattered. Because I could have protected him. I could have nodded, echoed his language, accepted the shared blame narrative. I could have allowed the truth to remain hidden in the name of privacy, dignity, or emotional efficiency. That was one option. Another option was confrontation, emotion, accusation, exposure, a rupture that would satisfy honesty but leave chaos behind it. And then there was the third option, the one I chose. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth, simply, precisely, without embellishment. I said that I had become aware of an ongoing affair, that I wasn't there to argue about why it happened or to negotiate conditions under which it could be forgiven. That I was there because honesty had already arrived for me, and I was no longer willing to participate in a version of reality that required my silence. The room changed, not explosively, subtly. My husband didn't deny it. He didn't confess dramatically either. He froze, caught between narratives. The counselor paused, recalibrated, and asked clarifying questions. I answered calmly. What mattered wasn't his reaction. What mattered was that I didn't flinch. In that moment, I felt something close. Not empowerment, not relief, but finality. This was the decision point, not the discovery, not the preparation, not the quiet observation. This, the moment when I chose truth over continuity. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I stated what I knew and what I would no longer accept. And in doing so, I closed a door. Some choices don't announce themselves as endings. They feel almost administrative, clean, undramatic. But they are irreversible. I knew as I spoke that there was no version of our marriage that existed on the other side of this honesty. Not because people can't rebuild, but because I would not rebuild on altered ground. I had crossed an internal threshold weeks earlier. This moment simply aligned the external world with the truth I had already accepted. When we left the office, nothing felt explosive. It felt settled, and that's how I knew I had chosen correctly. After the counseling session, life did not fracture the way people expect it to when a marriage breaks up. There were no dramatic exits, no emotional ultimatums, no visible collapse. What followed was quieter and far more deliberate. I understood something essential by then. Once truth has been acknowledged, noise becomes optional. Action does not require announcement. So I didn't announce anything. I didn't tell friends what had happened. I didn't call family for comfort or validation. I didn't post cryptic messages or seek witnesses. I continued going to work, returning texts, handling daily responsibilities with the same calm efficiency I always had. From the outside, nothing looked different. But internally, everything had shifted into motion. I began with structure, not emotion. I reviewed our finances carefully, not with panic, but with attention. I gathered documents, account statements, records that existed but had never required scrutiny before. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for accuracy. I asked questions quietly, neutral ones, the kind that don't reveal intent. I spoke to a lawyer without drama or urgency, not to initiate anything immediately, but to understand the terrain, to know what choices actually existed beyond the ones I had assumed. Knowledge has a stabilizing effect when your emotional world has already settled. I didn't rush. That's what people misunderstand about decisive women. We're rarely impulsive. By the time we act, we've already lived with the truth long enough to know it won't change. At home, I remained composed, civil, observant. My husband interpreted this as uncertainty. He spoke cautiously, offering half apologies and theoretical plans. He used words like process, space, and time. He assumed we were in a negotiation phase. I didn't correct him. Correction would have implied participation. Instead, I listened without engaging emotionally. I didn't argue his framing. I didn't challenge his language. I simply stopped supplying reassurance. That absence unsettled him more than confrontation would have. But I wasn't doing it to unsettle him. I was protecting my clarity. Every conversation, every interaction, I asked myself one question: does this require my explanation? Most things didn't. Silence, at this stage, wasn't avoidance, it was containment, a way of keeping my internal decision intact while the external world caught up. I noticed how quickly people fill the silence with their own assumptions, how my calm was mistaken for indecision, how my restraint was read as openness. I let them believe that, not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because my process did not belong to them. I was careful with my energy, careful with my words, careful not to leak certainty before everything was aligned. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about control. It was about sovereignty. I was no longer willing to have my choices shaped by other people's urgency, guilt, or fear. In quiet moments, I checked in with myself, not emotionally, but honestly. I asked whether anything inside me wavered. It didn't. There was no grief spiraling beneath the surface, no doubt waiting to be acknowledged. Just resolve. That surprised me more than the betrayal itself. I had expected to feel fractured. Instead, I felt consolidated. Silence gave me room to move cleanly, to plan without pressure, to step forward without being pulled back by unfinished conversations. I understood then that some endings don't need to be dramatic to be complete. They just need to be intentional. And when the time came to speak, to finally articulate what had already been decided, I would do it once, clearly, without anger, without explanation. Until then, I moved in silence. And that silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation, they arrived quietly, through absence, through what I stopped doing without ever announcing that I had stopped. For years, I had been a stabilizing force in my marriage, not visibly, not dramatically, but consistently. I remembered details. I anticipated friction before it surfaced. I absorbed emotional tension and translated it into calm. I adjusted my expectations so the relationship could continue without interruption. When I stepped out of that role, nothing exploded. But things began to fail. At first, it was subtle: small misalignments, plans that didn't quite work, moments where my husband seemed slightly off balance, unsure why things felt heavier than before. He forgot appointments, overestimated how much time he had, misread emotional cues. He didn't connect these disruptions to me. That's the thing about invisible labor. You don't notice it until it's gone. I stopped reminding him of things that mattered to him, not out of spite. I simply stopped managing responsibilities that weren't mine. I no longer smoothed conversations or softened transitions. I let interactions land as they were, without correction. The effect was cumulative. He grew restless, irritable, slightly defensive. Not because I had accused him, but because the environment no longer compensated for his assumptions. At home, silence expanded. Not an angry silence, not a cold one, just space. He tried to fill it with routine, familiar jokes, habitual gestures, casual affection. They arrived the way they always had, But they didn't land the same way, not because I rejected them, because they were no longer anchored in truth. I responded politely, civilly, without emotional engagement. And that neutrality confused him. People know how to respond to anger. They know how to respond to grief. They don't know how to respond to calm disengagement. Outside our marriage, the shift was felt too. I began declining social obligations I had once managed automatically. I stopped being the connective tissue between groups. I arrived less frequently, left earlier, and conserved my energy without explanation. Friends noticed. They asked gentle questions, framed as concern, curiosity, intuition. You seem quieter. You've been busy. Is everything okay? I smiled. I said I was fine. Not because I was hiding the truth, but because I wasn't ready to release it into other people's interpretations. I didn't want a chorus of opinions. I didn't want advice. I didn't want outrage on my behalf. I wanted clarity to remain clean. Meanwhile, my husband began to feel something slipping. He sensed a loss, but couldn't identify its shape. He assumed we were in a temporary phase, something that could be talked through, corrected, and restored. He didn't yet understand that restoration wasn't possible. He asked questions that hovered near the truth without touching it. Are you unhappy? Do you feel distant? Do you want to talk about things? I answered carefully, not evasively, but minimally. I gave him facts without reassurance, presence without promise, courtesy without commitment. That was when anxiety entered the room. Not mine, his. He realized something essential. I was no longer trying to hold the marriage together. And once that realization forms, panic follows. But panic doesn't announce itself immediately. It appears as confusion first, as bargaining language, as attempts to reset the dynamic without addressing its cause. He tried harder, paid more attention, asked more questions, and still, I didn't step back into the role. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because returning would have required me to lie to him and to myself. The real consequence wasn't punishment. It was reality asserting itself in the absence of illusion. When someone has built their sense of stability on your quiet endurance, your withdrawal feels like collapse, even if you leave calmly. And that was the moment I knew something irreversible had begun. Not loudly, but unmistakably. By the time panic surfaced, it was already too late. Not because I had hardened myself against reconciliation, but because the version of the relationship he was trying to save no longer existed. It had depended on my quiet endurance, my willingness to absorb imbalance without naming it. Once that endurance was gone, there was nothing left to stabilize. At first, his panic disguised itself as effort. He became attentive in ways that would have mattered years earlier. He asked how my day was and waited for an answer. He noticed my absence and commented on it. He initiated conversations that hinted at accountability without fully embracing it. It was earnest, and it arrived after clarity had replaced hope. That's the cruelty of timing. Sometimes sincerity comes too late to be effective. He wanted to talk about us again, about what had gone wrong, about what we could do differently. He framed his regret in terms of future potential, as if the right conversation might restore momentum. But I wasn't frozen in the past. I was already living in the aftermath. I listened to him carefully, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet compassion. I could hear that he was afraid, that he hadn't expected consequences that didn't involve an argument, that he didn't understand how much had shifted without him noticing. He asked if there was still a chance. I didn't answer immediately, not to punish him, but because The truth deserved precision. When I did respond, I didn't speak about betrayal or anger. I spoke about reality, about how trust isn't repaired by attention alone, about how awareness can't be undone once it arrives, about how some realizations don't invite repair, they invite departure. He tried to renegotiate the narrative, to reposition the affair as a mistake rather than a fracture, to frame it as something we could contextualize and move past. I didn't argue. Argument implies undecidedness. Instead, I told him something he hadn't considered, that I wasn't leaving because of what he did, but because of what I now understood. I understood how long I had been absent from my own life, how often I had made myself smaller to preserve peace. I had participated in a dynamic that rewarded my silence and ignored my presence. That understanding couldn't be reversed by remorse. He struggled with that because remorse feels active, redemptive. It offers a sense of progress. Clarity is static, it doesn't negotiate. His regret intensified as he realized that nothing he said was shifting my internal position. He oscillated between apology and frustration, between self reflection and defensiveness. And still, I remained calm. Not because I was unaffected, but because the emotional work was already done. The panic reached its peak when he finally understood that I wasn't waiting for the right explanation. I was finished listening. There's a moment when someone realizes they've lost influence over your decisions. Not affection, not respect. Influence. That moment is terrifying. He asked what I needed. I told him the truth. Distance, finality, space to step forward without being pulled back into negotiation. He said it felt sudden. I didn't correct him. From his perspective, it was. From mine, it had been unfolding for years. When something ends quietly, it often feels abrupt to the person who wasn't paying attention. And by the time he truly understood that, there was nothing left to fix. Not because I refused, but because I had already moved beyond the point where fixing was relevant. The final confrontation didn't look like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no accusation delivered with trembling hands, no demand for explanations. I already understood. It happened on an ordinary evening, in the same quiet space where so many unspoken things had lived for years. We sat across from each other, not as adversaries, but as two people finally occupying the truth without decoration. He was tense, not angry, not defensive, uncertain. That uncertainty was new for him. He asked me to be honest with him, fully honest. He said he needed to understand what this meant, what I felt, what I was planning. I agreed to speak, not because he needed answers, but because I was finished withholding clarity. I told him I wasn't angry, that I wasn't interested in punishment or humiliation, that I didn't want apologies layered on top of regret. I told him that what had ended between us wasn't just trust. It was my willingness to exist inside a dynamic where my silence was mistaken for strength and my endurance was taken for granted. He tried to interrupt. I held up a hand, not sharply, just firmly. That small gesture said more than any raised voice could have. I explained that for a long time, I had made myself emotionally available while remaining unseen, that I had adjusted and adapted and rationalized until the relationship functioned smoothly but without mutual awareness. I told him that the affair hadn't shattered me. It clarified me. That distinction unsettled him. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I said no, not cruelly, not dismissively, simply, factually. I told him that my decision wasn't fueled by anger, but by alignment. that once alignment is restored internally, returning to misalignment feels impossible, not painful, just untrue. He asked why I hadn't fought harder. I answered honestly, because I had been fighting quietly for years, and when I finally stopped, I understood what that fight had cost me. There was a long pause. In that silence, I felt something close to grief, not for the marriage, but for the time I had spent doubting my own perception. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. That was the closest we came to closure. There was no attempt to negotiate after that, no dramatic goodbye, just an understanding that the conversation had reached its natural end. When I stood up to leave the room, I felt lighter, not triumphant, not relieved, resolved. I had spoken the truth without heat, and in doing so, I had preserved my dignity. That mattered more than winning any argument ever could. After everything ended, life didn't suddenly become brighter. It became clearer. There was no dramatic reinvention, no sudden confidence, no declaration of freedom. What followed was quieter than that. A steady return to myself. I noticed it first in small moments. The way my body felt when I woke up in the morning, unbraced. The absence of that low, constant tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. The relief of no longer monitoring someone else's emotional weather. I didn't feel euphoric. I felt honest. For a long time, I had confused stability with loyalty, endurance with love. I had believed that staying calm meant staying true. Now I understand that truth requires participation, not just patience. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I didn't rewrite my personality to compensate for what I had endured. I remained quiet, but my quiet was no longer submissive. I started making decisions without preemptively explaining them. Not because I didn't care what people thought, but because I no longer centered my life around being understood. Understanding, I learned, is not always mutual, and that's okay. I became more selective with my time, more deliberate with my energy. I stopped performing emotional availability on demand. When people asked how I was, I answered truthfully, but briefly. I didn't narrate pain. I didn't dramatize recovery. I didn't need to. I also forgave myself. That was the most important shift. I forgave myself for staying quiet too long, for rationalizing the imbalance. I believed that my restraint would eventually be rewarded. Self forgiveness didn't arrive as absolution, it arrived as permission. Permission to trust my perception, permission to leave situations that require me to disappear, permission to choose clarity over comfort. I didn't harden my heart. If anything, it softened. But it softened around truth, not illusion. I learned that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't require an audience to validate it. Dignity is the quiet confidence of alignment. I'm no longer the woman who smooths everything over. Not because I can't, but because I won't. I still listen deeply. I still value calm. I still believe in kindness. But I no longer confuse kindness with self erasure. I know now that being underestimated is not a flaw, it's a vantage point, one that allows you to see clearly while others assume they already understand you. And clarity, once earned, is something you protect. Not aggressively, intentionally. This is who I am now. Not broken, not bitter, just awake. I didn't tell this story to warn you about marriage. I told it to speak about listening. The kind that happens before words, before proof, before permission. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant being wise, that restraint was maturity, that endurance was love. Those beliefs kept me stable, but they also kept me silent in ways that slowly cost me myself. What I learned is this: silence is only virtuous when it protects your truth. When it protects someone else's comfort at your expense, it becomes a quiet betrayal of you. There was no villain in my story, no dramatic collapse, no moment where one person became entirely wrong and the other entirely right. That's important. Because most real betrayals don't look like cruelty. They look convenient. They look like they are being taken for granted. They look like assumptions going unchallenged for too long. The affair was not the deepest wound. The deepest wound was realizing how much of myself I had minimized to keep the peace. How often I had translated discomfort into patience. How easily my silence had been mistaken for consent. And here's the part that matters most: I didn't reclaim myself through anger. I didn't heal through revenge. I didn't rebuild by becoming louder or harder or colder. I healed by telling the truth once and then refusing to negotiate with it. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authority over yourself. It's the decision to stop explaining what you already understand, to stop performing stability while slowly disappearing, to stop waiting for permission to leave a role that no longer fits. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: pay attention to what you normalize, the small dismissals, the quiet adjustments, the roles you accept without discussion. Because what you tolerate repeatedly becomes the shape of your life, and you deserve a life shaped by choice, not endurance. I'm not bitter, I'm not angry, and I'm not broken. I'm aligned, and alignment is peaceful in a way chaos never is. Before I go, I want to ask you something, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever stayed quiet in a relationship because it felt easier than explaining how you really felt? And what did that silence cost you over time? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter more than any advice I could give. Thank you for listening.